Welcome to Wolf Brothers podcast. Today I am speaking with George from TheTinMen. He is a content creator, writer, and pro men's advocate. Through his platform, George shares research and facts relating to men's mental health that you may not see talked about in the mainstream media. George, welcome to Wolf Brothers podcast.
Nice to be here. I also speak about boys as well, men and boys. But
Yes.
yeah, more or less correct. Thank you. Nice to be here.
Cheers. Yeah, I'm really excited to have you on the podcast and just to speak about some of these topics because I suppose my own background, I also work with boys and men. I work in schools doing workshops, specifically, helping young men deal with emotions such as anger and, start to discuss what masculinity means to them as they, move on into adulthood and stuff like that. So, and I also work with, but just part time, I work with men who are perpetrators of domestic violence. So I get to see a bit into that world as well. So I suppose for me, having you on the podcast to share some of the things that you've been discovering, it's interesting because it relates to some of the work that I do as well. So before we dive in, I want to maybe, if you want to just share a little bit about your own kind of, not your whole backstory, but just maybe like a little bit about how this journey you're on at the moment, how you got to this point.
Yeah, sure. So I sit politically on the left. I feel like I'm quite a progressive thinker, a liberal. I used to call myself a feminist, and I would speak quite passionately about all these different issues, including domestic violence in the way you described. Uh, and then I guess through my late 20s into my early 30s, I started to notice there was like a lot of blind spots, a lot of things that were being left behind, not talked about often because they were unpopular. Like you yourself just talked about how you talk about male perpetrators of abuse, but I'm confident you don't talk about male victims or female perpetrators. And that's what I mean. Those are the missing pieces that I feel leave the discussion incomplete and we can't sort of solve those problems without talking about the entire holistic approach between both perpetration and victimhood in that case. And I would just talk to a lot of my peers, a lot of feminist peers, especially on the left, and the way they would talk about men and boys wasn't necessarily wrong, but it wasn't the complete truth. So I made it my mission to try and fill in those unpopular gaps, to talk about female perpetration, to talk about male victimhood, to talk about many, many other issues that a lot of people I felt had neglected. And if anything, to also help women too, because I don't, domestic violence, sticking to that example, it's a cycle of violence. And you can't break the cycle without talking about both halves of it, the other half being women. So that was my mission. Very unpopular, been quite hard work, a bit like pushing this conversation uphill constantly, but also deeply rewarding. And it's good for me to make original content because there are so many issues that people just don't want to speak about. But I'll just dive headfirst into it. I don't mind so much.
Yeah, and I think that's what I really appreciate when I came across you first. I think it was
Hmm.
on the Chris Williamson podcast, and then I started following your content on Instagram, and I just respected that, the
Thank
work you're
you.
doing is
Yeah.
it's not
Well,
going to
it,
raise.
Well, it started off, I just wanted to have a series of like slides just for my personal use on me under the table often that had information as a reminder to me. And the reason I created the content was because it helps me commit it to memory. I wanted to know what's the latest information and data on domestic violence or homelessness or drug addiction or education, men's health, male suicide. And I just put them into slides on Instagram just so I could have them and then a few sources. So when I was discussing these issues that I felt really important, I wanted to make sure I was doing my bit. I was being vigilant. I was putting in my due diligence, and I would literally be talking about it, looking at the table, bringing in the latest facts, putting it down, and it was like I guess it was like my little secret weapon. And
Yeah,
then other people were clearly having that same conversation, and they wanted similar like archive information, and they started following me, 10, 100, 10,000, 20,000, 50,000, 60,000. And now I'm here. So I guess I've helped armed a lot of people with knowledge that they wish they had, or I wish I had, and hopefully having sort of helping people have more engaged and sort of backed up conversations
Hmm.
around the world.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. It's, when I was before this podcast, I was, doing some other, more research, and I was even chatting with my girlfriend last night about it, and you can nearly feel this like tension building because whenever I
Yeah.
have these conversations with women, there tends to be like this tension of like, oh wait, these are going to speak against women, but it's like, no, 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 it's we're trying to balance out this conversation that's maybe at the moment being a bit one-sided, and we're trying to show, as you were saying, show the facts and then show
Mm.
how this, these issues that are going on in society are affecting men, and just not to say that it's women's fault or men are more victims or anything like that. It's just, I think we, as you said, we need to see the truth of what's going on in order to change it. Because if
But
we're not looking at the truth, then we're just kind of fooling ourselves.
certainly, I mean, it's definitely not women's fault as a group. I mean, it really annoys me when people blame men as a group. So I'm certainly not trying to blame women as a group. But there are female abusers, and not a small amount of them. So those it is those women's faults. And like you said, I guess I'm trying to balance out that conversation. And sometimes men are victims more. So I disagree. Like in
Mm,
lots of violent crime as a whole, men are the number one victims of violent crime,
mm,
especially black men, especially young black men, especially young black men in inner cities, for example, particularly in gangs. They're the number one victim of violent crime.
mm,
And yeah, so they are definitely victims more than women. So that's one of the difficult conversations I try to have is often violent crime as an issue centered around women, yet they're not actually the number one victim. Men are, and like I said, young black men. So sometimes you do have to say, actually, this isn't the complete truth. In fact, women are a minority of violent crime victims. And that's not to say they're unimportant, but there's a huge half of the conversation that's gone missing,
mm.
and they deserve to be spoken about as well. So
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, brilliant. Yeah. Um, and I suppose when we're speaking about, like, there's so many topics to go into, but I suppose when we're speaking about, domestic violence,
Mm.
when I started working with the organization in Ireland, I went in with that mentality like men need to change their,
Yeah.
behavior. And then when I started going in there and started meeting these men, I'm like, okay, these aren't the monsters that I, was programmed to think they were. They're just men who maybe have inability to express their emotions in a healthy way, and they get triggered in relationships. And then I started seeing how, from meeting these men, how some of their partners were also being quite abusive. And
Wow.
currently,
Yeah.
there's no perpetrator program for women in Ireland, but since I
Yeah.
actually started working there, they've been looking into it now because they've seen the stats are, it's pretty much like equal in terms of men and women in terms of domestic violence. And I suppose if you want to maybe just touch on Erin Pizzi, I'm
Pitsy.
not sure how to, yeah,
Pitsy, yeah.
just
I
talk.
mean, it's so nice to know that. It's really reassuring for me to know that I've not spoken to you. I'm not even sure which organization you're speaking about.
Mhm.
I've not tried to feed you any sort of words here, but you've said to me what I sort of already know, which is that men and women are equally abusive, more or less, in relationships. There are as many male victims as female victims, sort of. That's what you're saying. A lot of the women, a lot of the men that are violent, in your experience, were also victims of violence as well. So obviously, I speak a lot about cyclical violence, and there's no help for them in terms of like help for male victims. So those are the sort of conversations I talk about, and it is validating for me to know that you're seeing that too in a different country, having never spoken to me, and that's quite nice. As for Erin, I mean, I also must say as well, in terms of women, like I have loads of women that follow me as well. Some women also do find these things hard to hear, but a lot of them find it very helpful, and I find it very enlightening to help understand the men and boys in their life. So, I mean, I always have to say one third of my followers are women, more or less. So that's tens of thousands. So they're certainly not the problem. In fact, they're the solution, and actually make up a large part of my most loyal and earliest, fiercest followers, just to give them some credit as well. As for Erin Pitsey is another woman. She's about 86 years old. She is the founder of the first refuge in the world for abused women in 1971. So I interviewed her on the 50th anniversary of her refuge. Her refuge was basically the first of its kind. She wrote the first book of domestic violence as well. Before Erin Pitsey arrived on the stage, domestic violence was seen as a sort of a private issue, quite an ugly, unpopular thing that people didn't want to know about. behind closed doors, family matter. Let's not, I don't want to hear about it, sweep it under the rug. And she was like, no, this is a huge societal systemic issue that's happening in thousands of houses all around the country, tens of thousands. And we need to talk about it. It needs to be, we need to actually discuss it. We need to help solve this problem. So Erin, her house was actually the first refuge. She brought the first woman into her spare room called Kathy. And from then on, she started to bring more and more women in. So she got a refuge, which she got as a squat. So she basically squatted there illegally, just brought women into this abandoned house. Men were part of the refuge as well, but they would come in and build a refuge, fix it up, because obviously it was literally a squat. So right from the very beginning, men and women were in the refuge at the same time, which doesn't happen anymore. But the men were there to fix it up, and they were there not to fix the refuge, but also to model healthy sort of manhood, healthy masculinity, to help these women could be around strong, healthy, kind men, so they could be re-socialized. Because obviously, what they know about men is normally male violence, and like if you've been marinated in male violence, and how what else are you going to know men as? So it was very important for Erin to have men in a refuge. And obviously the first squat got filled up pretty quick. So she got another one and another one and another one, took over whole streets of houses, which she just basically squatted in, got a hotel and like hundreds and hundreds of squats all over the country, bringing in thousands of women with no money. No one got paid. She never got paid. There was no funding whatsoever. Again, this is still a very unpopular issue. And she said she basically came to the same realization as what you said. She was a lot of these women that are victims were also violent themselves. So she famously polled the first 100 women that came to her as victims. And I think about 62 were violent, at least as violent as the men. So she was like, this is a lot more than what I think it is. This is not just about wife beating. This is domestic violence and it's going both ways in sort of equal measures. And often it's sort of linked in that way. So she then tried to open a refuge for the men and boys, and the support she enjoyed. She got some private donations. The private donations she did get all dried up, and people weren't as supportive of her at all. And actually, people hated the fact that she wanted to open a refuge for men, a shelter for men. And she went from like a national hero to like public enemy number one, more or less. And she was basically treated horrifically, like picketed, harassed, threatened. She had like bomb squad going for a male and a police escort around the country. And eventually she lost her refuge. The organization, which later became Refuge UK, basically kicked her out of it. And she was no longer the boss, and she left the country completely. You know, it's sort of, in many ways, in sort of fear of her life and for her family's life. I spoke to her, and the moment she decided to quit was when literally the bomb squad are going for a mail because someone sent her a package with like no no return address on it. And it was actually just it was a box of tofu, which is kind of interesting. But the bomb squad literally had to open it up, and clearly they thought there was a credible threat against her. And that's Erin. And now she's sort of the shadow of the domestic violence industry. No one really talks about her. She was, like they said, like the pioneer, the women's domestic violence movement. And now she's living on income support in a one-bed flat, not a particularly glamorous lifestyle. And the people that replaced her at Refuge UK, they went on to earn hundreds of thousands of pounds a year as CEO. And now she's living sort of a very modest life. Although she did recently get CBE. Last year she got her, in fact, this year she got her CBE. So she's getting some recognition, but I'm always trying to give her more. And yeah, Erin Pitsey, worth Googling.
Yeah, it's amazing. I've never heard of her until I was starting
Exactly.
the page. Yeah, it was
Which is
like,
incredible, seeing as you work in domestic violence, you
yeah,
don't know the name of the person who set up that industry, that movement, who started it. You don't, that's exactly the point. Like she's been erased.
yeah, you'd presume
Hmm.
that'd be part of our training, maybe, and how it all
Yeah,
started.
well, no, because the training that you're probably getting is the exact training that got her thrown out because she never saw it as one directional. She was like, this isn't a gendered issue at all. This is a family issue, a generational issue, passed down from parent to child, parent to child, parent to child. Doesn't have a sex because a little girl that experiences violence in childhood is no less sort of vulnerable to becoming violent herself.
Mm,
And it was the fact that the training you might have had and the training that Erin believed in, and the difference between the two and how you can't reconcile them, that's what caused the friction that got her thrown out. So absolutely not. You will not be hearing about her. That's the whole point.
yeah, but it's yeah, it's great to bring her name into this
Yeah,
conversation, and yeah, and I know it seems like this is, people talk about. I know you hate the word patriarchy and stuff, but people talk about how this is almost, people pushing back against this patriarchy like too far, and we've gone too far. But even though when you look at the facts, like men have suffered a lot under this patriarchy. It's not that we were somehow, you know, just like living the high life. Like if we look at male suicides, for example, over the last number of years, that's been like higher. Like I think it's 80% over here is
Mm,
male of suicides, 80% in Ireland, and then I think it's pretty much similar over in the UK.
yeah, about 75%.
Yeah, and from my point of view, looking at it, I suppose is one of the main. I know you have lots of research done on some of the reasons men, I suppose, take their own lives, and it's not necessarily seen as they don't see themselves as having mental health issues, but it's rather like problems that they can't really
Mm,
solve. I suppose I've looked into the mental health issues as well. I suppose if for men who do have those mental health issues, it's usually around not being able to tap into their feminine side and express emotion in a healthy way. That is one part of it, but I think that's the only part that we hear. We just say men need to, talk more, and men need to cry. But as you've seen, like that's not necessarily the whole picture.
I don't agree. I'm not sure what that even means, that men aren't communicating themselves in a feminine way. I was like, well, that's not surprising, seeing as they're men.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps the answer is actually people are not actually listening to the way men want to express themselves. Maybe men don't express their emotions like women because they're not actually women, or more mostly aren't women. Generally, they express themselves differently. That doesn't mean the way they express themselves isn't useful or worth listening to. And I would say the responsibility is down to yourself and me and everyone else to actually learn about the way men do communicate, because it's not like women. I have a friend called Martin Seeger who I would put forward as one of the most important experts on men's mental health in the whole country. He was head of psychological services in a large NHS borough specializing in men's mental health, and he's worked at Samaritans, quite literally picking up the phones, talking to these suicidal men who apparently aren't communicating in a feminine way. And he noticed too, like the men that are calling us needing help, the phone calls are not lasting as long as those from women. Like they're hanging up the phone earlier. Why is that? So Martin basically did a massive training program with the Samaritans to help train the Samaritans themselves, who are picking up the phone about what's the male experience like, what are men's issues, what are they going through, how are men communicating their distress? Is it like women? Is it not like women? A year's worth of training about understanding men's issues. Did the poll again, and now suddenly the phone calls are lasting just as long as the women's, and yet the same men were calling with the same problems, but now the phone calls are lasting longer because the people answering the phone had been educated. The men were not communicating any differently, or not calling with any different issues, but the people listening had changed, and suddenly they were then communicating in a way that was as long and as in depth and eloquent as the women. So I would say it's not down to men to learn to communicate as women. It's down to yourself and those like you and me to listen to men in a way that they're already communicating, rather than just to shovel it at men, at men. Like, oh, men aren't talking, and that's just not true. Like they've done studies on suicidal men and found that more than 9 in 10 suicidal men did seek help, did go to mental health support services, and still killed themselves. 91% of middle-aged men who died by suicide did seek help. So
Yeah.
that's the real problem, in my opinion. Uh, I don't know what the patriarchy even really means anymore, but I certainly know that within domestic violence, absolutely not a patriarchy. The domestic violence industry itself is 95% plus women. So that's not patriarchy. All the most senior positions, all the CEOs and heads and owners are women, not men. And the model of domestic violence we're using, which doesn't work, is one based on patriarchy. And it's basically the fact that we think it's the patriarchy causing domestic violence is actually the problem itself. And then the patriarchy model of domestic violence, which is what pretty much all domestic violence organizations use, aka the Duluth model, doesn't work, is broken, and doesn't see domestic violence for what it is. So I would say us looking through the patriarchy keyhole is the problem itself. The patriarchy in terms of domestic violence is a sham, is a complete sham. And we need to let go of that word, like just stop using it unless you're talking about it in a historical context or for other countries around the world. Because I would say that concept itself, not the patriarchy, but the concept of the patriarchy and the people that insist on holding on to it, they're the problem. and you're looking for a very thin, tiny ideological keyhole at an issue, particularly male suicide, which is deserving of so much more detail.
Hmm.
And that's what needs to change. Like the people listening to men need to change, not the men themselves necessarily,
Mm.
or at least both sides need to change. So yeah,
Yeah,
more to it, I'd say, especially male suicide.
yeah. No, I like the way you spoke about that. It's how we listen is what needs to change, because
Yeah.
I I also hold like men's circles, and like we do get men coming. Like I would feel that it's important for men to be in touch with their masculine side as well as their feminine side. I believe we both have a masculine and feminine side, so
Yeah.
it's healthy to be able to move into both and be able to express your strength and your power, and but also be able to express that slightly more vulnerable side.
Mm,
And that's so in a men's circle, it is a chance to express that more vulnerable side, which I think definitely helps. But as you were saying as well, a lot of the men that are, you know, dying by suicide is
mm,
because they can't solve the problems that they're facing.
mm.
One of those big problems being um, like losing custody for their children. So
Yeah.
you want to speak into that and males' rights to their, to see their children.
Mm.
Yeah.
Well, that's what I mean. There's like different systems, and in different systems, different people have power. So in the domestic violence industry, women have power. In the family court system, women have power. In the psychological industry, women have power. These industries that are dominated by women are designed for and by women and advantage women. And like we can go into any each of them. There were also systems that advantage men, like the financial industry perhaps advantages men. The educational system advantages women and girls. And that's why I really hate this concept of the patriarchy, because it's just one big broad brushstroke across all of society that suggests all power in every single context is held by men and is exercised for men. And it's just not true. I'm more than happy to go into any of those industries you talked about, but domestic violence, education, psychological industry, dominated by women and are set up for more for women than for men.
Yeah.
Um, so that's what I would say. And men's groups are very helpful. That's the sort of the first step, I think, in the right direction of understanding how men communicate and how men share distress. Because often it's more, they like to do it more in groups, men do. That's why groups are better for men, generally speaking, than for women. Because the way we currently talk about sort of therapeutic interventions is someone goes into a clinical space, sits down, a bit like you and I sat down, but in person. You're speaking in a clinical environment with normally a woman, a professional therapist, and that's just not how men like to communicate as often as women do. Like they want to be in groups, they want to be talking to another man, they want to be with their peers, and often they want to be sort of in more physical space, like hiking, for example, playing sports, playing golf, driving a car, going for a run, walking the dogs. They want to be doing a bit more what's called shoulder to shoulder time. So face to face time is more for women in traditional therapy settings. Shoulder to shoulder time is people in groups, talking in groups, doing some sort of physical, sort of kinesthetic exercise. And the modeling that goes on by men seeing other men communicating is very helpful, creates a safe environment for them to share.
Mm.
And I'm glad to see it. And yeah, I wish we would do more shoulder to shoulder time. I like every time a men's group opens up, I think it's an excellent thing and very, very helpful. But I guess I also want to recognize that the men's groups are not the be all and end all of solving things like male suicide, because ultimately the problems that men are discussing at these groups will not be solved by talking. They're elsewhere. So you mentioned family court. A lot of men die by suicide and are going through extreme pain because they've lost their child by a corrupt family court system. Family court being another industry that is not dominated by men. The power is held by women. And I would say a man that's losing his child in family court is going to go through extreme pain, and that pain can only be partly alleviated through talking. The solution to that problem is him getting his child back or him getting equal custody. So I admire these men's groups, but I also recognize they're not the complete solution. The complete solution is systemic change. In that case, changing the way family court and works and child custody is awarded.
Yeah. And I heard you before using that analogy of, I think it's like the pressure cooker.
Mm,
Like you can turn down the heat. So you can take the lid off, and maybe that's by talking or whatever. But you need to turn down the heat to solve the problem.
yeah.
That heat is there in
So
many
I,
areas.
w- I work with a male suicide researcher called Susie Bennett, who I love talking about, and she describes male suicide as like a saucepan of boiling water sat on a hob, and the boiling water is bubbling up, and it's the lid's lifting off, and it's coming over the sides, and there's pressures building inside the saucepan. A man talking is the equivalent of lifting the lid off that saucepan, and you're allowing it to breathe. The water comes down, the pressure's released, and the situation sort of momentarily made lesser. But eventually, the lid has to go back on. The talk can't last forever. The lid has to go back on, and we go back to where we were. No, talking doesn't do anything to turn off the heat, the hob itself, but it allows a man to vent and express himself, and it will bring down his distress, but it doesn't turn off the hob. We need to turn off the hob or work out what that hob is. What is it? Is it a man in family court? Is it a man who's being abused? Is it a man that's in debt? Is it a man that's losing his job? Like, what actually is it? Is it a mental health problem? And that's why we need to speak about male suicide as individual cases, very sort of individual to every single man. I don't know. I have no idea why a man would take his life. I need to speak with that man. But that's not something we can do.
Mm.
So I would like to any conversation on male suicide or any suicide in general needs to be about what is that individual gone through, uh, in their own right, rather than seeing it as a singular one word sort of solution.
Yeah, and like I see, campaigns by big organizations and charities, like just Men's Mental Health Day, and it's just like men need to talk, and yeah,
Yeah,
you're kind of like, oh, for fuck's sake, it's still
we are talking. Like,
yeah,
men are talking. People aren't listening. That's the problem.
mm. Because I suppose we're getting this contradiction of like men need to talk, but then it's also like when we start talking, it's kind of like you've had your time. We don't want to hear about your problems. That's kind of what some men feel. So they just feel like, what are we doing here anymore? And I think, another issue for men is like they're starting to lose that sense of purpose as to like, why are we here? Because,
Mm,
you know, if you look back culturally, maybe it was put to provide and protect, but now
mm.
the police force is taking over the protection. Well, they're supposed to anyway. And then, the supermarkets are taking over the providing. So it's kind of like, what is our role here? And I think that for a lot of men, I've just noticed myself, it's that kind of lost sense of purpose and meaning.
Yeah, that's another big part, like a sense of mattering, you'd call it, where men don't know why they're here. They've talked to men and women, like they've polled them, like where do you get a sense of meaning from? Women get meaning in their life from a lot more different sources. So they'll have friends, family, work, money, home, hobbies, their networks, different sort of groups they're in. Whereas men seem to only have meaning from two places, being sort of money and work, work, money, work, money, work, money. So I'd say the answer to that is to help men find meaning in other places, such as being a great dad, being a great friend, having hobbies, joining different groups, not just work and money, although those are very valuable. And the way it's changed, I don't think it's necessarily changed because of the police force, but as women have entered the workplace over the past 50 or so years, which is a wonderful thing, they are now sharing that burden of work. So in America, 40% of breadwinners are now women, which means that a lot of men have now taken a back seat in terms of being that provider, which is not a bad thing. I think it's great that women are becoming breadwinners and becoming autonomous. But we need to understand what that means for men in the sense that they're no longer able to meet this 1960s style breadwinner archetype of a man that goes to work, comes home, has 2.5 children and a stay-at-home mum, and he's there earning all the paying all the bill. That's just not possible. That's less possible than it was. So as women, as the purpose of women has been widened to become breadwinners, so too we need to widen men's sort of purpose and help them find more meaning and to celebrate men outside of just being a provider and bread role. To look at like fatherhood, for example, and also give men equal rights to their children.
Mm.
Um, Equal rights to children, equal rights to paid paternity leave, and basically have a renaissance of what it is to be a man. In the same way that we've seen that over the past 50 years for women, in a wonderful way, we now need to do the same for men, change what it means to be a man, whilst also respecting and understanding that masculinity isn't the same as femininity, but we do need to broaden it for the sake of men themselves so they can find more purpose.
Mm. Yeah, I like that. It's broadening the conversation to allow men to discover what a man means to them instead of,
Yeah,
yeah, kind of trying to relate to the old archetypes and not being able to do
yeah.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's why Andrew Tate and
Mm,
Atal are just arseholes in my opinion because they're not. Their men are trying to find purpose elsewhere, and he's just putting them back into that same box of,
Mm.
fast cars, beautiful women, big houses, millions of pounds in the bank, and those are the things that are just very difficult to achieve for the reasons I described. And I'll be like, why can't you talk about other things that are perhaps a little bit more achievable? But
Yes.
no.
And I suppose in terms of, what would you like to see change in terms of like laws? Is there anything out there at the moment that is obviously it just needs to change in terms of,
Mm.
like what do you see changes need to be made?
In terms of systemic change, people don't like to put the word systemic change or systemic sexism and men together, but unfortunately, the reality is there are ways in which the system does hurt men, especially the legal system. So, actual laws I'd like to see change. The Children Act, which is in the UK, the main piece of legislation that decides who gets rights and who doesn't. And that's unmarried fathers don't have equal rights to unmarried mothers, and fathers don't have equal rights to mothers, and that needs to change. Like, but all parents need to have equal rights, and all children need to have equal rights to both their parents. So the Children Act needs to change. The Sexual Offensive Act needs to change. So the Sexual Offences Act is a bit like the Family Act, the Children Act, where it basically sort of lays down the fundamental framework of what sexual violence is. And in the UK, women still cannot be found guilty of rape, which is an outrageous sort of misjustice. So in the UK, by law, you have to have a penis to commit rape, which means that any woman that rapes a man is not considered a rapist and does not go down in the legal system as such and is not captured in data that way either. So I feel like we need to have a gender neutral definition of rape, which we don't.
Yeah.
So those are two laws I'll change. And then a third law I'll change is doing domestic violence. So this is more of sort of the frameworks need to change. So I talked a lot about the Duluth model. The Duluth model is the most influential model of domestic violence, which is based on men's so-called need for power and control. And that sets up domestic violence as something that men do to women, one-way street. But women aren't violent, and men do it because they're enacting their patriarchal need for control, which is a very absurd, extremely narrow, exclusionary view of domestic violence. And I'd say that needs to change. I would like that dogmatic approach towards domestic violence needs to be removed. From any tax-funded shelter cannot be using that. We need to be using a gender-neutral, evidence-based, modern perspective of domestic violence that sees it as non-gendered and bidirectional largely, and cyclical and generational, amongst other things, and stop using a model that's 50 years old and never really worked. Um, so and also, there's loads of things. I would like to bring a minister for men in.
Mm.
Like, there's so many issues that I talk about. So homelessness, addiction, men's health. Men have high mortality rates in every age group. Boys are behind in every stage of education. 3 in 4 suicides are men. 70% of drug deaths are men. 9 in 10 homeless deaths are men. 95% of workplace deaths are men. Huge amounts of problems that are impacting men. And there's no governmental position for men and boys in terms of men and boys issues. So in the UK, we have a minister for women, we have a minister for women's health, and an ambassador for women's health, which are great. I have no problem with those three positions, but none of those exist for men. There is no minister for men. There is no minister for men's health, and there's no ambassador for men's health. And I'm like, at least one of those needs to exist. The issues men and boys experience, the fact that suicide is the biggest risk to my life and your life, is reason enough to have a minister for men. So I would say I would like to see that brought in.
Mm.
Uh, and just a change of the educational system would be nice. Like I mentioned, that boys are behind every stage of education in the UK and in Ireland and in more or less every single Western society in the world. And there's a lot of evidence that the education system is systemically biased against boys.
Mm.
Teachers mark boys lower for the same work as girls, and
Mm.
the system is just more designed around the way in which girls learn as opposed to the way boys learn. And that's largely because, like I said, it's a area that's dominated by women. About 80% of teachers are women, so naturally it's going to advantage girls more than boys. So I
Mm.
would like to see a review and change of the way we educate and the way in which the psychological industry works as well. Same problem. It's like 85% of clinical psychologists are women. Like I said, they're naturally, not intentionally, nothing nefarious about it, but naturally they're going to create systems and strategies and spaces and ideas that are more advantageous to women And I would like, we need more male psychologists. We need more male-friendly psychological interventions. We need more male teachers. We need more like male-friendly educational styles. We need to change the Children Act. We need to change the Sexual Offences Act. We need to appoint a minister for men. We need to throw out the Duluth model. There's a lot of work needs to be done that is beyond men talking, because that's where we are now. Like men can talk, and I'm like, okay, yes, but also, look at all these different things that also need to change. That talking will not change. That change comes from legislative change, political change, and lots and lots of campaigning.
Yeah. Yeah, it's great for me to just get a sense of how some of these, things can be changed because you've done a lot of research into this. And I think, yeah, what needs to be changed in the UK is pretty much the exact same here.
Yeah,
Like we're very close in that sense.
yeah, and also just like extending the laws that apply to women and girls to men and boys. Like
Yeah.
not so much of a problem in Europe, but things like circumcision are huge problems in America. It's like 60% of boys are circumcised when they're babies, and there's like 85% plus of men in general circumcised. And I'm like, you can't like a girl's body is protected by law. You can't do anything to that girl's body surgically until she's 16 or 18 and she can consent. A baby cannot consent to anything. That's the whole point. And that's an amazing law we brought in, the Anti-FGM Act, which is basically protecting girls from any sort of non-consensual and medically needless surgeries. But that doesn't apply to boys' bodies. Like I said, like millions of boys are circumcised every year in America. 100 boys die every year as a result, and there's no need for it. There's absolutely no need whatsoever. Very few of those cases are done for medical reasons. Circumcision is normally for religious, cultural, aesthetic reasons, or just because it's what the dad has. And I'm like, it doesn't matter. Like, do not be altering the genitals of your child. That boy's that boy's body should be protected by law, just as a girl's body is protected by law.
Hmm.
So I would just say extending the legislation that already is in place to protect women and girls to men and boys would be also a great change alongside the ones I've already mentioned.
Yeah. And yeah, this circumcision thing is, I haven't actually watched the video. I know you were saying on a podcast,
Horrible.
look up a video, but I haven't brought
Don't
myself
do it.
to look at it yet. But I think, yeah, it's crazy when you think about it.
Everyone's just like, oh, it's just a little snip, a little flap of skin. I'm like, it's not. Just go watch a fucking video. It's horrible,
And
horrible, barbaric, often about any sort of anesthesia. And it's not, it's like literally it's deaths, like deaths.
and it's also the most sensitive part of the male penis, so it's denying them
Yeah,
pleasure, to reach a certain amount of pleasure when they
yeah,
are older. So, and I also feel that there is more behind it as well, as in like it's disempowering when you do that to a man, I think. And
mm,
I feel like the reasons behind a lot of these issues not being publicized are like this kind of media agenda that seems to be pushing the men are the perpetrators and men are the problem. Like I feel that is just to kind of get men to shut up and be quiet, and then
yeah.
it
Well,
disempowers us. Then we don't stand up against things we don't agree with or regimes we don't agree with because we're
well,
afraid, we're disempowered.
a lot of men are just stepping out of the political conversation completely for both women and men, and they just don't want to be involved. They're just like there is actually no representation for things that matter to me. Everyone keeps telling me I've had my say and I have all the power, and but it's like show me any of the male politicians that are advocating for men and boys. Show me one politician. Challenge you to find a single politician right now that's talking about any of these issues, any of them from a gendered point of view in terms of for men. You won't find any. So I would say that to them. And going back to circumcision, you're absolutely right. You're removing most of the nerve endings of the penis and the most sensitive part of the penis. And it's essentially people keep talking about how it's more hygienic, which it isn't. And the actual motivation for circumcision was basically to deprive boys of sexual pleasure, just like FGM was. And it was brought in as a sort of cure for masturbation in like Victorian times. That's what it's for. It's nothing to do with hygiene. Now, obviously religious context as well. But the point is, it's completely unnecessary and barbaric, and it deprives boys and men later in life of sexual pleasure. It dampens sexual pleasure. It can cause significant biological problems, such as erectile dysfunction. It can lead to deaths. It leads to clotting, infections. It's a serious surgery, and it can traumatizing. Like I think about 50% of boys that are circumcised like that are trauma have actually meet PTSD for trauma because it's a horrific surgery. And like you said, if you look at a video, you'll see it for yourself. It's not a little snip. It's horrible. It's a horrible, horrible thing that we're doing, and we need to stop doing it.
Yeah. And I feel it's a heavy podcast, but I think it's
Yeah,
things we need to hear,
sorry.
and it must be tough for you to like.
That's what I mean. It is heavy. It's depressing, and that's the point. Is that these issues are so much more broader than just men aren't talking. There's
Mhm.
so many bad things happening, and I wish we talked about it more. And I'm sorry it's so heavy.
Oh no, I'm trying to I empathize with you that like to
It's all
carry
right.
this kind of mission, must be tough. But in terms of something else, I heard you speak about, and I was just reflecting on it again this morning, and actually, what made me quite emotional was just thinking about the Boko Haram and
Mm.
this male disposability that you speak of, and how if you want to speak a little bit about that.
Moral disposability is a theory that suggests that the lives and well-being of men and boys, particularly men, are seen as less valuable, more disposable than the lives of women and girls, especially in times of crisis and disaster. So everyone's heard of the women and girls first, women and children first. So I guess male disposability is giving that a different name, where the men can stay behind, you can stay on a sinking ship with a burning building, and you'll die, and then we'll get the women and children out. A lot of it, people say, is based on the fact that women have greater reproductive value than men, which is, I understand, and is actually true, but that isn't a good enough reason to leave men on a sinking boat to die. And yeah, I've talked about it in the context a little bit of Boko Haram, which were a horrific sort of terrorist group in Nigeria, still exists to this day. And famously, they kidnapped, I think 2014, they kidnapped about 273 Nigerian girls, and it created like a worldwide cultural movement of bring back our girls. I'm sure we all saw the signs of bring back our girls being lifted above the heads of celebrities on red carpets, and Michelle Obama got involved, and the American, British, and Chinese government are all sharing data, which is unheard of, to find these girls. And a lot of the girls were safely returned. Um, and it became a massive cultural movement, huge amount of sympathy and support, outrage, quite rightly brought up to bring back the girls. But over the following 3 or 4 years, 10,000 boys were taken by Boko Haram, turned into child soldiers or killed, and no one said anything. There was no cultural revolution. People don't actually believe me when I say that, but you can just Google it. There's some amazing articles by the Washington Post about it. But really, there was very little said and done about the fact that 10,000 boys had been taken, and yet a huge cultural movement quite rightly happened when a few hundred girls are taken, 10,000 boys did nothing. That's just like a small example, and it happens all the time. Like even right now in Palestine, the horrific things that are happening over there. You'll see articles that are like bomb kills 100 people, including 50 or 20 women and girls, or women and children. Like you'll often see women and children brought up in certain headlines around sort of loss of life, and you're like, well, who the hell are the other 50 or 60 people? I assume they're the men, and it normally is. It's again for Iran, the Iranian Revolution, for example. That's seen as like a women-led revolution. You'd be forgiven for thinking that women are the ones paying the biggest price for that revolution, but people don't realize that 90% of protester deaths are men and boys, and no one talks about it. Like they're erased. It's always about what's happening to women and children in Iran, and there are horrific things happening to women and children in Iran, but there are also horrific things happening to men and boys. Uh, and we only ever seem to talk about one half the problem. And I always think it's linked to competency. Like my view in the way, my understanding of sexism in a simple way is that men are seen as more competent, which they aren't. Of course, women are just as competent as men, but in a sexist world, we see men as more competent. But the price of that is they are seen as more disposable, a bit like a tool, like a hammer. You sort of throw it away when you're done with it. Women are seen as less competent, which again is sexist, but the benefit of that is they're seen as more precious, so they're more deserving of saving and sympathy. And those two sort of sides come together, and that's obviously very broad brushstrokes. But I'd say men are seen as more competent and disposable. Women are seen as more incompetent but precious, and all of that is wrong. Like women are just as competent as men, and men are just as precious as women.
Mm.
And we need to sort of look at both sides of that.
Yeah. And in terms of, just say there is like people listening to this podcast, just regular people who they may not be in any political position, but what can we do as regular people to like start to, you know, change the narrative?
I would say challenge yourself to listen to what men are telling you. Try and create a space where men feel safe or heard or not not judged for communicating certain things we may not want to hear. Learn to listen to what men are already saying rather than constantly asking men to talk. Maybe open ourselves up to the idea that men are talking, but we're not listening, or we're not listening in the way in which they want to be heard. And I would just say try and be a bit more compassionate in general towards men. Try to see people as individuals rather than a member of a group is one of the things I really believe in. Like the individual version, me, I'm George. I'm a person shaped by my individual experiences and my environment. That's the way of best understanding who I am, rather than a white straight man, which is just my group. And to see men as individuals and individuals deserving of sympathy, I think. There isn't a huge amount you can do or should be doing other than just trying to be a bit more sympathetic
Mm.
and try to challenge our views of all these different issues and try to understand that there's more to men's issues than them not talking or crying. Uh, so yeah, I think that's a lot. It's a lot to do, but I guess just in an individual basis, that just try and take care of the men in life a little bit more.
Mm. Yeah, I think that compassion piece is the most important. It's like
Mm.
to just drop all these labels of white and male um, and just
I
see.
wouldn't say drop them,
Yeah.
but they're not as important as uh, my label of George. The most important label is my name and me as an individual. That's not to say
Mm.
me being a man and me being white and straight isn't important at all. That obviously shapes who I am as well, because I do have a different experience to a black woman, for example. But I would still say the most important label is George, me as an
Yes.
individual.
Yeah. And something I think something that I want to start doing as well that I feel will really help this, and I've seen it help build that compassion is, you have
Mm.
the men's circles and you have women's circles, and they're
Yeah.
great. I think they're important spaces to have on your own. But then we've done mixed circles in the past, and what I've seen there is just like where we're both coming together as men and women and sharing. Get a chance to share what's going on for you, honestly, from the
Mm.
heart, not from the head. And then it just creates this like natural compassion because you're like, oh fuck, I didn't understand as a man. I didn't understand, how that woman, experiences, this issue because I just can't understand
Mm.
that. And the same when men start talking, like, and the women just see
Mm.
the other side and they're like, oh, now I'm starting to understand. When you're in that circle, everyone's equal. Like there's
Yeah.
no leader of the group. It's just we're sharing our experiences honestly, and that's how you build stronger communities where people, we understand each other and we're not falling into these old wounds where, maybe we were wounded by a woman or a man in the past and then we're kind of like nearly feeling against them. But when we come together like that, it just heals a lot of that.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I
I
think
mean,
that's what we're missing in society, those spaces where we come together and are just honest and share what's going on.
like I said, like I mean, I obviously speak pretty much entirely about men and boys, but that doesn't mean there isn't a massive half of the conversation that isn't being said.
Yeah.
And although I'm trying to encourage people, including women, to try and listen to men and how men express, there's just as much work to be done by men to do the same for women. And I'm not saying that women need to sit down and listen to men because there's two tables and two seats, and men need to listen to women, women need to listen to men in the same judgment-free way. And yeah, I don't want to frame this as a one-way thing.
Mm.
I only talk about men because that's the sort of gap in the market I'm in, but there's absolutely important work to be done. And there's lots of education of men to understand women. I just wish it was done in a sort of apolitical way where we just quite literally sat down as two humans and be like, oh, tell me about what it's like to live life as a woman. Okay. And now tell me what it's like to live life as a man. And it's often not the same. They're normally quite opposite. And I've learned so much by listening to women. And I wish I'm going to keep doing it. And I'm going to encourage others to do the same. But yeah, absolutely, I agree. I'm only talking about half the problem as well. There's another half that I've not discussed,
Yeah.
but not because it's not important to me, and not because I don't believe in it, but only because it's just not what I speak about.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's two-way street for sure.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's a great place to kind of sum up what we've been discussing is that we've just went into one half of the problem, and yeah, it'd be great to maybe. I want when I'm doing this podcast, I just want to get different perspectives from different people,
Mm,
different, and just let people paint their own picture of what's going on based on all these perspectives, and just yeah broaden our horizons and how we see things. So yeah, it was really
amen.
a pleasure to have you on and discuss some of these things, and yeah, I really appreciate the work that you do, and yeah,
Well,
well,
thanks for having me. It's
yeah,
lovely to be here and have a chat.
yeah, and I suppose in terms of if people want to find you, I suppose Instagram being the main place.
Yeah, I mean, there's Instagram, there's LinkedIn, there's Twitter or X and Discord, but Instagram is probably the best place to start. So at the Tin Men, one word. And yeah, I'll see you there. Lots of interesting content, lots of conversations, quite big, thriving community, quite vibrant,
Mm,
lots to talk about.
yeah, and do you have anything at the moment, like in terms of? I know you had a petition going last year. Is there anything like that coming up that we could look out for? Or?
Yeah, I launched. Well, we just had a general election in the UK, and obviously Keir Starmer's only prime minister. I didn't vote. I support the ballot, abstained, and only because a lot of the issues I speak about and care about are not represented by any politician. Although I would normally vote Labour. So I've released the Tin Men has released a manifesto talks about these issues, and we're basically selling postcards that you can buy at ministerformen.com. That you basically buy them. It's a pack of postcards. It's pre-addressed to Westminster, so for UK people only. And the idea is you take an issue, the issue's on one side of the postcard, you fill it in, and your MP is already there. You put a stamp on it and put it in the post box, and it goes to your MP. So that's what it's all about, like basically writing to your MP, trying to make that as easy as possible, and basically demanding the change that they're so reluctant to give to us. So you can find those at ministerformen.com. And all proceeds go to sort of supporting the content creation process. Of it goes without saying, when there's no money in this space really. There's no brand deals or sort of big donors, no philanthropists. And a bit like what we talked about Aaron Pitsey, like when you talk about men and boys in this kind of way, the funding disappears.
Yeah,
And the same for me. So that really helps. So yeah, ministerformen.com to find out more.
brilliant. I'll put that in the show notes as well, and
Please. Thank you.
maybe we'll have to do something similar with the cards in over in Ireland here. Uh,
Yeah, yeah. People keep asking me, like, oh, I want these postcards that I can send to my prime minister or the president in America, and lots of people wanting it. And
yeah,
yeah, it's an
brilliant.
interesting concept.
Yeah, fair play. It's a great idea. But yeah, thanks again, George, and yeah, we'll be following you on the Instagram and maybe see you again soon.
I hope so. Yeah, I'll just come back.
Yeah, cheers.
Bye bye.